Hello, everybody out there. There's no way for you to say hello to me back, but I trust you're there. Thank you for turning up. This is the London Society, and we're very happy to have you here on this very cold evening before lockdown 2 starts. So thank you. Really are some planning enthusiasts. The London Society, we're running the planning school again this year. It's been running for a number of years. We take on a range of topics which all pertain to urban development and planning in this great city of ours. And this year, we've turned the spotlight, or the kind of the mirror, to ourselves in an international frame of reference. Last week, we heard from Takeshi Hayatsu, speaking on the Japanese experience in his hometown of Tokyo, and really a wonderful kind of insight into how kind of a seeming lack of planning regulation kind of leads to quite an intricate and complex fabric that's both has these strange juxtapositions of scales, but also allows architects to have a flight of fancy. Tokyo being kind of an incredible place that's shaped as much by, let's say, the building regulations, which are very unique to that place, and to taxation laws. So thank you if you join that talk, and we are going to have an equally fascinating talk tonight with our guest Kathryn, who I'll introduce in a second. Next week, please join us. David Rudlin will be speaking on the European experience as we go continent jumping through this planning school, and in particular speaking about the French very regulated environment of French planning. And David has a particular kind of interest in that, as he's advising the central government at the moment on reforms to the planning system here. And I'm sure you all went out last week after the session and filled out your consultation to the white paper. Let's see what ensues from that. We are turning our attention this evening to the States. Funny enough that the States is in the news lately. And there's no better person I know to speak about that experience than Kathryn Firth, who is no stranger to the London Society here, having been an executive committee member in previous years. But Kathryn is an architect and urban designer with some 25 years of experience. And she has recently returned to London, having spent a more recent stint in the States, where she was director of urban design at the well-known practice MBBJ, where she led projects such as the Boston Downtown Planning Study, which we'll be hearing about a lot more this evening. Previous to that, she was in London as the Chief of Design at the London Legacy Development Corporation. She has taught at the LSE Cities Programme, the Architectural Association, and continues to teach urban planning and design at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, where she's been a visiting design instructor for the past 3 years, and teaches on a Thursday night, which is why we're having this here on a Wednesday evening. So without further ado, Kathryn's going to talk for about half an hour. Please put your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll pick up as many of those as we can at the end. But over to you, Kathryn.
Thanks very much, Daryl. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Okay, everyone fine with that? Thanks very much for inviting me. I think this is a great series, and I'm glad that the others who will be taped, because as Daryl says, I'm going to be teaching when the last one happened and when David speaks, because I think, you know, it is obviously very topical. I am going to, as Daryl said, talk about my experience with the planning system in the States, but in Boston specifically. You know, the general approach, as far as I can understand, because I was working in a number of other American cities while in the States, is similar, but I wanted to show the downtown plan as a kind of case study as to what the breadth of zoning really is, and you know, whether or not it's an effective tool and how that interacts with things like design codes. However, before we get into Plan Downtown, a little bit of context with some planning tools. So zoning, you know, no surprise, this is what it addresses: land use, uses, the dimensional characteristics of a building in relationship to its context, you know, height, FAR, setbacks, parking, dwellings per acre. So if you come along and, you know, you fit into the zoning requirements that are stipulated in each of these categories, you can build as of right. If, however, you want a bit of a variance, you want to be set back a little bit more, you want to challenge the parking ratio, so a minor variance, then you would be going to the Zoning Board of Appeal, ZBA, or ZBA as it's called over there, which I had to get used to, of course. And they make decisions, you know, as a group. It's city departments and the Boston Planning and Redevelopment Agency, which is the agency which essentially has planning and urban design under it. So I will be talking a lot about the BPDA. That was our client. And the public also weighs in. And what comes out of this then is a scoping determination, which basically says, you know, we need to understand more about, you know, these issues before we can actually decide whether or not we're going to give you permission. However, if more than a simple variance is desired, so there are a number of things that you want to change and challenge in the zoning, then you go and apply for a planned development area, PDA. This is essentially an overlay district that sits and supersedes the zoning district. It needs to be at least an acre in scale. And then it has special zoning controls around it. So you have to submit a special development plan. You need to get approval from the BPDA and the Zoning Commission. There's a comment period from the public. And then there's certain, it'll go in front of the design review, and I'll talk about the design review process a little bit later on, that it'll go in front of the Boston Civic Design Commission. And you, at this point, start to get into some serious negotiations, because this is where you actually have to specify what the particular public benefits are that the PDA will provide. So in a funny way, starting to get into a realm that we would probably liken to either S106 or SIL in a funny way. But the point that I want to leave you with here is that really negotiations are on a case-by-case basis, despite the fact that there is you know, a zoning overlay. So development review is something where it comes under this jurisdiction of Article 80, where there's a review of a project which is either a PDA or a project of a certain scale or civic importance. And you can see I've listed down there, you know, either you're adding more than 50,000 square feet, sorry that it's all in Imperial, or you're building more than 20,000 new. The other thing, which is a kind of new animal that I wasn't familiar with coming from here, is an institutional master plan. So within any, you know, piece of the city where there are institutions, it could be healthcare institutions or a higher education institution, they in a sense are almost like their own PDA. They are outside of the typical zoning, the zoning that governs an area. And you do an application every time you make a change to, you know, your hospital or your university, you submit an institutional master plan, which then goes through development review. And the players, you can see then on the right-hand side, the developers, the applicant, the city, of course, and that BPDA team I mentioned, and then the community. And this is quite important because this, the community can put forward a group, which is the Impact Advisory Group. Now, what's interesting about this is that the members are actually nominated by the local elected officials, which means that they are not really representing all voices. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, because the elected officials obviously have a specific agenda and put those people forward. However, they do then provide feedback on the proposal, and they suggest, they weigh in on what those negotiations are in terms of public benefit. I wanted to share this with you because, as Daryl said, I'm teaching in the urban planning and design department. at Harvard right now, and we're looking at a project in South Boston. And I invited the BPDA to come in and talk about the process. And they put up this, what you'll agree is a very crystal clear and easy pathway towards getting a planning application through. I'm not going to take you through this, leave it to be said that you can see that there are a number of moments when things kind of circle back on themselves. And that is not a kind of, perfectly straight line from one end to the other. And I'll come on to that a little bit more when we start to look at the specific project. Now, I mentioned that there is, as part of development review, is really a design review commission, which is composed of architects, landscape architects, urban designers, land use lawyer, and a developer. And they look at exactly what you would expect, the height and scale, how does it fit in with the context, etc. And members of the public are welcome and often do in quite large numbers attend these meetings. And there is a moment when they're asked to voice their opinion as well. So they actually have quite a heavy influence on the city and the choices the city then makes. And then that brings us to codes. And many of you will have heard the phrase form-based codes, which essentially is saying codes that are actually built into the permission, if you like. And they look first at building form, and use is second. And so I won't read through everything here that they cover, but it's exactly what you would expect, exactly what any building code or design codes that we've all worked on would have as part of a package of codes. The important piece or the important element is that they are just guidance unless they are embedded within the zoning. And in many cities, Boston being an exception, where there's a kind of very clear reticence to embed codes into their in the zoning regulation. In many cities, they are embedded. And I'm sure that this is something that David's been finding in his research. But I think that what's important here is that if these codes are regulatory, what is the extent, the physical extent, the geography, and I know this is something that's getting a lot of debate and airing as people are considering the National Model Design Code. So again, I will come back to that in the context of downtown. So let's go downtown now. So this is downtown Boston, the Charles River over here. I'm assuming you can see my cursor. This is Cambridge. This is where MIT is. This is what's referred to as the Fort Point Channel. So one of the newer areas is the seaport. But then downtown, which is actually one of the first areas to being settled in Boston, is where also some of the most important historic assets are, and that is something very important. Now, one of the first things that was part of the brief was that we learned that the city had not defined what the actual boundaries were. So actually, as part of our RFP response, we went and did a kind of survey across the office and said, what do you consider downtown Boston? And people named anything from kind of where City Hall is and in a very sort of small area around transport to a very vast area, which included this neighborhood that's referred to as the Back Bay. Well, in the end, the city handed us this funny sort of fish shape. And I think, as we all know, boundaries are quite political. And what was interesting about this was that it did not include City Hall, which is up here. And the argument for that was that there was actually a project going on looking at City Hall at that time. It did not include this area of the waterfront. Again, there was a kind of coastal and flood mitigation study that was going on at the time. But most importantly, it actually severed the area that's referred to as Chinatown, which is down here. And it's a very sensitive area. And I'll come back and talk about that a little bit later. So it's an odd shape, but this is the shape we were given. And unlike when you're given a master plan project, we all know as master planners, we never stay within the red line. We actually had to adhere to this line quite severely. I do want you to take note of where the Boston Common and Garden is, which is the major green space for downtown Boston. Our brief was to develop a framework for the preservation, enhancement, and growth of downtown Boston as a place for all, balancing livability, daylight, walkability, climate change preparedness, access to open space, affordability, and a dynamic mix of uses. And part of the brief was to test this through development scenarios to sort of understand, what that balance between growth and preservation could be. There was an advisory group that was brought on. Again, this is quite a political move. Boston's a small town. I mean, probably here in London, we would know everybody, if there was a group like this for a project which was this high profile, between us, we would probably know everybody on that list. But certainly, although many people put their names forward or people were nominated, and it is open to the public to be on this advisory group, the city made the selection in the end. So, they know who might be on side on a project like this and who might be a troublemaker. We did not have any say in who those participants were. There was also a quite intensive program of public engagement, from a launch to a series of workshops where there was a lot of outreach done to make sure that the members of the different communities participated. They were also able to voice their thoughts online as well. This was also controlled by the city, with us really providing the support material. So after a number of the sort of early engagement exercises, these goals and strategies were articulated. The first two, in a funny way, are the most important, that it's about preserving cultural heritage, but at the same time encouraging economic development. So a bit of a balancing act. The rest of these, again, I won't read it out. They are all rather high level, and you could probably say you'd want any downtown to do this, or any neighborhood indeed. But for our challenge was then, how does that get realized and how does it really hit the ground? And that leads us to then looking at development scenarios, where we were basically charged with demonstrating how much new development downtown Boston could accommodate based on city regulations and the availability of properties, and how is value created for developers, and then most importantly, what's the value of public benefits that would be generated? How, what are those benefits, and how does one decide which benefits are distributed where? So just returning to our funny fish shape, as I said, this is an area, downtown Boston is really, one of the oldest areas of the city of Boston. And so there are a number of historic assets here. And of course, Paul Revere, as is marked here by the Freedom Trail, which some of you may know. So there are a lot of areas that do need special protection, in addition to the historic Boston Common, which I'll come on to. There are a number of what we were referring to essentially as kind of character areas as well. Many of these names are well known by people in Boston, whether it's Chinatown, the Theater District, Downtown Crossing, which is also sort of a main subway station. And of course, they have fluid boundaries because that's how we move through cities. We don't have hard boundaries. We don't know when we cross the street that we're immediately crossing into another neighborhood. So there's an overlap between the characters of each of these. Now, one of the most complicated aspects of the challenge we were handed was to get our heads around this regulation, which is essentially that no new shadows would be cast on Boston Common and the public gardens. And this was put in law by, in the first place, a kind of Boston Common shadow law. And I won't read through all of this, but sunrise and sunset are a very important part of this story, as are the seasons. But as well, there was a second layer, which is the Midtown Cultural District, where because there are already buildings that were casting shadows, because that's right up against Boston Common, because there were already, and I'm just going to flip back actually to show you, well, I can show you right here. So that's this area in here, the Midtown Cultural District, because there were already buildings in there that were casting shadow, they in sense created this shroud, if you like, to kind of protect those, to grandfather those into the clause. And I'm just going to show this to you quickly. So it's essentially, I mean, I sort of, as I say, think of it as a sort of set of shrouds or veils that are determining, in a funny way, the building heights. And so you can see there's the Midtown one is in red, and that's coming up from the common. And then as you go in behind that, there's a, another shadow regulation. So, this gives you the sense then of the kind of distance or amount of height there is between the existing buildings and these shadows. So in the current zoning as it stands, you have height stipulations. There are these, many different heights which are stipulated by different sets of regulations, from the general zoning to the PDAs that I mentioned, to the preservation, to also, most importantly, the Federal Aviation Association, where administration, where this area can only be a certain height because you have Logan Airport actually not that far away. And then in addition are the FAR regulations. So in the end, you have three sets of regulations, which are kind of, standing up against, or any project goes up against, to do with height, FAR, and the shadow regulations. At first glance, that sounds simple. When you start to draw it out, you can see that you've got this sort of myriad of PDAs, and then the FAA, and then, as I said, the two different shadow regulations. So it starts to look quite complicated. And one of the things that we held, in addition to having the advisory group and doing public consultations, we had a series of roundtables. And we had a series of roundtables where we asked the city not to attend so that people would be quite candid. And some of these were held with small businesses and with developers. And they all have been throwing their hands up in despair, which the city knows, because this is not a transparent system. It's not clear. You don't know exactly where things stand. And then you do know that you somehow have to go into these ad hoc negotiations on what to purchase above the existing zoning. So just so you can fully appreciate how complicated it is, I have another animation for you. And you sort of have to look at all of these sort of overlapping regulations. And I think you can start to understand that if you, are looking to buy a property and develop it in downtown because you think that's, a fruitful endeavor, or you own a property and you want to know what you can do with it, it's a little bit complicated to really understand what's possible. And then finally, the piece of the puzzle that I mentioned before, which is, what is the funding? There's a need for funding for public benefits. And broadly speaking, those fall into these 6 different buckets: affordable housing, which of course often in the US gets referred to as inclusionary housing, climate and resilience, transportation, small business support, which when you're looking at places like Chinatown is incredibly important, historic preservation, and open space and public realm. So we turn to the tool of incentive zoning, where we're looking at what maximum heights and buildable areas can do to create additional growth potential. And then, whether that's referring back to the character areas, which it needs to as a kind of starting point, understanding the street network, and then the overlays of the public realm. And this, incentive zoning allows the potential for a density bonus system to generate quite a bit of revenue. Of course, that does depend on the sort of boom that was going on in Boston. And you can see these are some examples of the kinds of new development or hats that buildings are now wearing, where they've looked for every opportunity to gain height. Of course, that's all pre-pandemic, and the situation, when we did this study, was that there was a lot of growth in multifamily apartments, that there was a lot of new offices being built, and more in the pipeline, that there were fewer and fewer sites in other neighborhoods. So in Kendall Square, some of you may have heard of that. Next, it's cheek by jowl with MIT. The life sciences and biotech industries have just, have sort of crowded out that area, and people are now looking at other neighborhoods like the Seaport for those sorts of developments. They also require very large floor plates, as you'll know. And so in the end, a more predictable regulatory regime, of course, would make development easier. So we looked at 2 scenarios. One was sort of pure growth-based density bonus system. The second was trying to really find a way to balance preservation and growth. In both cases, the developer would be purchasing capacity through the density bonus system. So in scenario one, we essentially said, okay, there's a baseline zoning height. And baseline, when I use it like this, really means as of right, of 155 feet, which is sort of the average height of buildings, the sort of 20th century buildings you get downtown. That then needs to be coupled with the shadow regulations and the FAA height limit. So you start to get diagrams that look a bit like this. So you start with your 155 feet and your shadows. And then if you sort of say, okay, that red line is now indicating what you can purchase. You can purchase the area between the 155 feet, the as of right line, and that red line. And that's essentially where the revenue would come in. So if we look at that, broadly over the area, you get this kind of contour map of what's allowed because it's always referring back to the shadow regulations or the FAA heights. The second scenario, where we look to more carefully balance preservation and growth, we said, okay, now this is a moment to sort of bring in our character areas and understand where sensitivities might lie. And so that meant that for Chinatown and the Wharf District and an area called the Ladder Blocks, which I'll point out, that there actually, is a kind of finer grained set of stipulations. Whereas then for Downtown Crossing, the Theater District and the Financial District, you could have the sort of broad brush of 155 feet for as of right. So that starts to look something like this, where you've got the 155, but then it sort of drops down in areas, and this is completely abstracted at this point, where it starts to drop down in areas where there are those sensitivities, where it's, there may be older buildings, that there's a finer grain that you don't want to lose. And so that starts to give you a diagram that looks more like this. So the ladder blocks, this area here is immediately adjacent to Boston Common. It is, a sort of oldest piece of city fabric. Then you kind of jump up because of the strangeness of the two different shadows intersecting. And then that gives you this slightly bizarre shaped envelope that brings you back down to another area, which in this case, you could say is Chinatown. But as I say, these are very abstracted, and I'll get to some actual sections in a minute. But here, there's a slightly less, potentially less development potential public benefit capture, and a little bit less room for new development, in fact. And so that starts to look a little bit more, it's a bit more of a patchwork, but still we would argue a lot clearer than what the starting point was that I showed you with the current zoning. So in this case, if we just go to yet another animation, you can start to see that there is some clarity. So that pink in the foreground there is where Chinatown's located. Then you go back to saying, okay, you can build up to the sort of red shroud, but then the Ladder District, you bring it back down again to the 100 or 125. And then as we come around, from the east side, then you can see there's another area, the Wharf District, called so because it's so close to the water. And then sort of above and in from there is, of course, the FAA height. Now, of course, as soon as you start doing this and naming areas, the nice fluidity of neighborhoods and character areas starts to have to get a bit more rigid so that you can actually apply the zoning as a law, as a regulation. So we had to draw some hard lines, which of course is always very controversial, and then start to look more closely at, the ladder blocks and Chinatown to see what the impact really would be. So if we look at Chinatown, where you have the baseline of 155, and this now is an actual section through a piece of Chinatown where there are a number of the older buildings. There is still room for growth, and we felt like understanding these corridors, these traffic corridors, that actually was appropriate. But it's still quite a bit of growth that would probably start to change the character, which is why then when we went to look at scenario 2, we brought down that considerably so that you have a kind of 100-foot baseline, but you can only then go up 150 to 155 feet. So in that sense, trying to maintain the character of Chinatown. Similarly with the ladder blocks, and this image in the corner gives you a sense of that grain. You know, you start with this regulation. If you're allowed to build all the way up to here, you could well imagine that there's some serious towers that people might take the opportunity to build, which would radically change the character of that area. Whereas when we go to scenario 2, you get this, you know, much more restrictive area for development. You do, however, then this rather bizarre cliff edge, and that was something that we wanted to study a bit further. So we were left sort of with these 3 different scenarios of the current zoning, scenario 1 and scenario 2. And, you know, we also started to do a few tests on specific sites. So this happens to be a site in Chinatown to understand, you know, how much area was really gained. So, you know, if you did scenario 1, that you would get a 207,000 square feet, whereas you would only get 94,000 square feet when you have the 155-foot height limit. So the question is, you know, how does that then start to translate into, you know, public benefit, money back to the city that can be then redistributed? So if we look at the current zoning, actually there should probably be a giant question mark over this, because you have essentially the development costs, the developer return, and the land value, and then whatever gets negotiated. Whereas the system that we're proposing, which, you know, many of you will be familiar with, development costs of return, the land value, and then additional value, which allows for that public benefit. And this is a very, you know, simplified sort of formula where the value of the public benefits are calculated by multiplying the bonus square feet by proportion of the value per buildable square feet. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether that the 80% that we were proposing, first of all, is that correct? Should it be, you know, land value, which, you know, before the pandemic was very, very high, or should it be construction value? And in either case, that, you know, at the end, the remaining 20% is the developer's incentive. And then you have a set of public benefits that can be distributed across. And so we actually, you know, tried to plug some numbers in, again, pre-pandemic, to understand the difference, you know, in 2030 and then out to 2040, and what you would sort of reap, what the city would get back between the 2 scenarios. And you can see this, you know, in 2030, there's you know, a couple of $100 million difference. And it actually doesn't change that much when you start to get into 2040 and build out from there. And I guess, you know, for us in the end, it's, you know, what it's essentially asking the city and the citizens, what is the lower, or what is the value of character preservation? You know, if our mission was to balance growth with preservation of character and specific assets, then, you know, is it not worth a couple of $100 million to you know, allow for that balance to kick in, even though it means that there's less funding for some of these public benefits? So that was kind of the question we put to the city. But this was not the only part of the study. So we did create a set of design guidelines. And as I said, unfortunately, they did not the city did not see those becoming form-based codes, which I think in the area that we're talking about here, which is about 96 hectares, they actually, you know, given how specific we could be, and we did get into this, given the character areas, the identification of those character areas, that we could get quite specific, and that these codes actually would arm the city quite well as development came along. So when it stays as guidance, we all know that, you know, guidance is much easier to challenge. We also put forward a number of policy recommendations. So, you know, items, issues to do more with, say, you know, affordable housing, you know, the percentage of affordable housing, flood mitigation, et cetera, that is not necessary, or small business support, that's not immediately translatable into, you know, a code per se. And so we touched on, you know, buildings built form and of course the public realm. And then we even went so far as to start to identify where those priority improvements could go. So once you have those buckets, you know, what are the areas, what are the public spaces that immediately tomorrow, you know, when developers come along, they could start to, you could start to see improvements, and that these would not have to be co-located with where the development was happening. And then the big task at the end, how do you implement all of this? And the management of the public benefits is something which frankly is not being bottomed out, but essentially, you know, we were saying, okay, the city's BPDA should serve as the manager or some other authority that has representatives across it. They take the developers' contributions, and this is again, you know, highly simplified as to, you know, you can imagine what the various quagmires are that one could fall into if they didn't keep it simply. And then you have a kind of city board that prioritizes and has an overview of how this funding is then distributed across a variety of different departments who are responsible for parts of the public realm, whether it's the streets, the parks, you know, the what's happening below the streets even, etc. And this was something which would really be the next stage to figure out where each of these overlap and how you would then, you know, make sure that that funding is getting dispersed in a sort of fair and equitable manner. So that brings me to the end of a sort of overview of a kind of rather whirlwind tour of the system. I will say, you know, I'm sure somebody's wondering what's happened with all of this, and I am too. And it's not just because I've left town, but this all came to a grinding halt with the pandemic because the mayor, things needed to then go up to the mayor for approval. And they were starting to get complicated again because everybody was sort of, you know, vying for attention in terms of, you know, where their PDA was and how it might be threatened. But it all came to a grinding halt. But I think one last thing I want to leave you with is that I think one of the things that I've learned is that in a funny way, zoning is quite a blunt instrument. So if I give you an example, in Chinatown, where, you know, I talked about there are a lot of sensitivities, there are some very historic row houses there that everyone in Chinatown is very keen to protect. And the city's response is, well, we can protect that through zoning because if we give, you know, we'll make sure that we bring the height down there. And our argument was, that's not the way to protect something historic, because at the end of the day, even though you've provided a height limit that's similar to the existing buildings, what's to stop a developer from saying, actually, these are bloody expensive to maintain. I'm just going to take it down and make a new building where it's a lot cheaper than me trying to renovate row houses and make them fit for, you know, habitation. So I think, you know, that's why we had a set of recommendations that went hand in hand with this. And then lastly, I was going to mention, because you probably saw me only focusing then on height, we did a kind of litmus test across the whole downtown to make sure that we were not reducing the FAR anywhere, because that, of course, would have gotten a lot of property owners quite up in arms. But at the same time felt that because of height and because of the existing density on the site, we could simplify things by just focusing on height, and we did not also need to stipulate FAR. It kind of took care of itself. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Right, thanks, Kathryn. That's amazing. And I hadn't realized it's kind of fairly fresh off the boards. Well, it's gone to kind of the various. It was on its way to the approvals, but this is work. I mean, what did people concerned for the length of time that local plans take to get you know, formulated and adopted in the UK and London? How long was this a process?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. So the RFP put this as a 2-year process, and essentially, you know, as we often have here, it was like the funding stops at that point. So we suggested, because not surprisingly, like so many public projects, the fees were rather tight, that we would do this in 18 months. And they accepted that. However, that all got scuppered as things got drawn out with, and now who knows, right? So we did complete the mainstay of what you're looking at it was probably closer to 20 months because of, various back and forth in consultation, fine. But then now, as I say, you should reasonably be able to do this in 18 months to 2 years and have the consultation and start to, and yes, this last slide where I talk about implementation, obviously there are nuances that need to be worked through.
Yeah, yeah. Probably a little quicker than what we do here, I would say.
Well, it's a smaller place and all the players are very clearly understood, should we say. So, I think that does have an influence on it as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think in the chat there'll be a lot of questions kind of comparing people's experience from the UK and London to what you've described. I mean, one thing that kind of stands out for me is the idea, if I read this right, that there is actually no public benefit unless you go beyond the as of right kind of envelope, whereas I think virtually anything would attract some Section 106 or community infrastructure levy payment in our current system. But it's kind of interesting that the threshold is quite high.
Yeah.
That encompasses what it was considered a developer's right or landowner's right.
No, that is right, unless you, forget what I've shown you with what we were proposing. If you were doing a planned development area, yes, or is building of a certain scale and import that they would be looking through those negotiations. So that's the thing. So there were always negotiations with larger scale projects. So yeah, not something where, it's whatever, 5,000 square meters or 500 square meters or whatever. You're not going to get into having to contribute to public benefits. But anything that was relatively large scale, there would be still a negotiation. But I think again, we looked at what we were proposing, and it wasn't like there were any public benefit that then would be lost if we put in place the scenario 2. That would be lost compared to what you would get today from those negotiations.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. How are there other cities? I would have thought that Boston's fairly enlightened in terms of a culture of allowing kind of public benefit to enter in and to be quite instrumental within the planning process, compared to perhaps some more sort of libertarian cities in the States. But you said that they weren't adopted as form-based codes, and did that surprise you? And are there other cities that are kind of seen as more progressive in this respect?
Yeah, I think that there are. I think we did a little bit of work, in Philadelphia and other projects in some of the other cities in the Midwest, where they are more comfortable for whatever reason with adopting form-based codes. There was a very, despite the fact that Boston was booming and that there really is almost, they're running out of sites that are kind of in the core of the city, they shy away from making life a little bit too difficult or too challenging for developers. And the thing that highlighted this for me the most, and I don't know, people looked at me like I was from another planet, was that in terms of, inclusionary zoning, as they call it, but really essentially, providing affordable housing, and the formulas, to how you define affordable is very similar to here. In Boston, it was 13% of units, which seemed incredibly low to me. And every time I brought that up, I was told that it just doesn't pencil out. The number of times that phrase came was sort of impressive. And Cambridge, which is much more, of a kind of, if you like, what a night to be talking about it, but sort of left wing or, a city in its political stance, it was 25%. And that was considered just like, deep intake of breath from the people, on the Boston side of the Charles River. So there are a number of instances, in parts of Boston where already that's been used as what the developers have bought. So they've bought capacity through saying we're going to provide more affordable housing. But it was interesting to me because they were always sort of throwing back in our faces the cost of materials and labor. And I found it hard to believe that, proportionally it was that different from London. But I think it's not. I think it's actually more about a mindset. Maybe I'm being unfair.
And developers were part of the consultation process.
Yes, and it was quite interesting because the developers who were more sort of recent arrivals to the table, like they bought a property or owned property, not for a very long time, or were thinking about it, like we tried to include developers who didn't necessarily have property in the downtown. They were ready to not necessarily embrace the percentages we were talking about in terms of 80% land value, etc. But they were certainly open to the conversation, whereas the old school developers who were very used to kind of gathering in the back room with local officials were not very happy. And as it happens, especially because some of them, quite a bit of the land that some of the older developers had within that latter district area when they've just been sitting on that property, those properties, which frankly, are starting to fall apart, which is very sad. So, so there's definitely a generational divide, which I suppose you'd find in your niece city, We
have a question from someone anonymous, and I guess perhaps kind of sort of talking about the context of the piece of work. And asked in a few words, what was the core and basic aim of it? And perhaps, there are some plans that are formulated at times of growth or times of change. Was there anything perhaps that was prompting this, I guess, is kind of behind this question?
Sure. I mean, I think what the city of Boston was finding that the downtown was not competitive with other areas of the Boston region. So it was not staying competitive with parts of Cambridge, or the Seaport area that I talked about, which is basically to the south. And then some areas even further out, like businesses were starting to locate, even further out from the center, or the sort of, main Boston, city of Boston area. And they, everybody wanted to be sure that the local businesses would continue to be supported. I mean, it's exactly what was already happening is what we've seen exacerbated by the pandemic, which there were shops in downtown that were boarded up, that are people sitting on their properties because they didn't really understand the system and couldn't be bothered to make their way through it. So they were just kind of waiting to see what would happen with the market because they didn't, as I say, there was no clarity as to what the way forward might be. And so it was really about making downtown Boston competitive with the wider region. And I think that, that was very much a catalyst. And, downtown Boston, there was a lot of money that in the past decade actually had been invested into the public realm. And yet it has not been well loved. There was a formation of a business improvement district. And I think a lot of the businesses were also calling for something more radical to happen to act as a catalyst towards growth. And also, I think at a certain level, the city just wanted to understand, I sort of probably bored everyone to tears with these funny animations, but no one had ever looked at that before. They had not seen that. They had a group from Esri on board, but they've never actually modeled what it meant so that someone could kind of look under the shroud and say, oh gosh, like without harming anybody, not casting new shadows or harming the neighbors, I could add 6 stories to a building. And so I think, to be able to understand that capacity was very important to them.
Liz Wrigley kind of comes back on that and says, making downtown more attractive might involve less density, ?
And she's right. And that's why we were proponents of the second scenario, because that's where we just said, you know what? We don't want a lot of growth here because you're going to start sacrificing the character of the area. And so that's why 2 of the character areas and 1 piece within one of the other character areas, we said, let's suppress the height. There's plenty of space elsewhere. And again, you know, I'm not boring you with all the number crunching that we did, but there's plenty of space elsewhere to provide density that won't, I think, in our opinion, harm place. So let's concentrate there. And remember, again, this is why for me it was disappointing that the codes may not be enshrined with the zoning, because it was always talked about that you need the codes alongside the zoning, so that when you're in those, especially when you're in the more sensitive areas, that you're controlling how that density is dispersed.
Mm-hmm. But that would kind of, I don't know, if you were a developer, you might say, oh, well, you're giving an incentive, but then there's this other kind of guidance that we've got to adhere to.
Yeah, I mean, I guess yes, it depends how onerous that is. I mean, I think in some cases, it was not necessarily onerous, and that's, you know, some cases we took the decision, you know what, we actually don't need to come down with a heavy hand here, because no one, you know, is going to build something where you've got, you know, bedrooms a meter apart from each other. Like, it's just not going to happen, because no one's going to want to live there. So it's, you know, we're not at those crazy levels, although I guess, you know, when we turn to what happened here with some as of right rules, maybe that's a bit cavalier. So
maybe we got something to teach. We can be a kind of a sort of cautionary tale for some of Boston. Claire Martin asks, did the density bonus, this was kind of earlier on in your talk actually, so I think you've answered part of this. Did the density bonus pay for public realm improvements? If so, was there a public space master plan to illustrate a network of routes and open space improvements? I know you showed some spaces, but was there something kind of more extensive?
There was, yes. We did what we, I mean, and it was in, you know, kind of light print, but we identified priority projects, and we worked very closely. And I've been very naughty because I haven't credited people the practices we worked with. So we worked with Kittleson, who are transport planners, and Arup for both their public transport expertise and smart cities. And then we also worked with HRNA, which, you know, so many of you know, economic development consultants. So yes, we actually did quite an in-depth audit of looking at everything from where there was conflict between pedestrians and vehicles, because there's all sorts of bizarre rat runs that go through the center of town right now, which are completely unnecessary. We suggested streets that might become two-way rather than one-way, and then we suggested extending the center of around the what's called the T-stop, the subway stop. Downtown Crossing is a small pedestrianized zone, and we actually suggested extending that. And that was something that we also tested through public consultation, and there was a lot of appetite for taking cars out of the center. But again, you know, one wants to balance that with making sure that businesses are actually thriving on ground floors, because we all know how deadly that can be otherwise. So yeah, so the answer is very much yes. And then we had a joke when COVID broke out that our team would go out and start extending the pedestrian zone while nobody was looking, and then people would come back after the pandemic had finished and sort of go, I don't remember it going quite this far, but because it was so empty, of course, there was nobody downtown, so we thought we could have the run of the streets anyway.
Well, the Lowland Society ran a debate a few weeks ago on low traffic neighborhoods, which have been kind of these sort of cutting off of through traffic in many neighborhoods, but being fast tracked extremely quickly through the lockdown, which has absolutely polarized communities. So that was quite a feisty debate.
Well, it's interesting because they actually had done a couple of streets where what they call their, you know, road diets had taken place. These were, in one case, it was actually paid for directly by the developer, where literally it's called Tontine Crescent, if you want to look it up. It's quite nice, actually, and it was very low cost, let's see, and then it would be turned into something permanent, where they literally took out a lane of traffic for about 2 blocks as a test, and it's worked really well, and it includes the cycle lane. And then in another area in Chinatown, they created an area where, again, it was sort of the width of a lane of traffic for a block, and put in seating and planting, you know, both temporary measures. So it's actually it was quite nice to see these being tested, because it meant that we could use those as examples and people kind of got, oh yeah, we actually don't need to have cars everywhere and dominating our downtown.
I love the term road diet.
Yeah,
That's brilliant. It's
yeah,
brilliant.
well,
As though it's just a bit
exactly.
horrible.
Very American about it. You know, if you say diet, it's low-cal. It's low-cal public realm. So.
I had a question about, in one of your earlier slides, it had the players involved and attorneys were part of one of the bubbles.
Yeah, attorneys, did you say?
Attorneys, yeah.
Yeah.
Could you, are they, do you want to explain this, or my imagination could run on about how litigious American society is?
And you'd be right, yeah. I mean, there's a whole breed of land use lawyers that work with developers on the negotiations. And so they have a very important role because you send your lawyer to negotiate what the public benefit is. So that is, yeah, it's a very serious role. And to the extent that people, a developer-led RFP might already have, like, just like we might have, you know, whatever, you'd have your usual, you know, landscape engineering, you know, covering various areas, you would have a land use lawyer on the team from the onset.
And what's the kind of the worst case scenario? Is there a special like planning inspectorate that they or equivalent, or is it done in the civil courts as an infringement of rights?
I think mostly it doesn't get to that scale.
Yeah.
So it's done much more at the sort of local level through negotiations with the city. I mean, unless, you know, that was always what the city was afraid of, that if we impose this, even, you know, scenario 2, that people who owned land in the latter district who were working under a previous regime, that they would come and sue the city. So something like that, you know, could escalate if they felt like they had an attitude. Now, you know, you could say the city might say, well, you know, you own many pieces of land, and do you really want us to give you a hard time when you come with some of the stuff that you own that's not in the latter district? So it's quite up close and personal that way, actually.
It does. And is the city administration, I mean, you say there was a previous regime. Is it kind of, are there political alignments if it goes from red to blue? Does that mean anything for planning?
It can. I mean, I think that who the mayor is does become very important. So the previous mayor, who was far more pro-development, and so for some of the old school developers, they were his pals, and so they've found it hard, which is partially why they've kind of sat on their land now, because they know that the current developer is, I'm calling mayor, sorry, is much more concerned about striking that balance and ensuring that there is public benefit and it isn't just carte blanche.
Yeah. It's telling that, I mean, the Centre for London is doing their London conference at the moment, and that they often do some, I think they have a constant platform to get more power for the London mayor.
Yes,
yeah.
Well, you know, I think when you have the right, what we would see as a sympathetic mayor, that's incredibly important. You know, and that's why I sort of feel like, you know, you know, we've sort of, like a film, in the old-fashioned way, a film reel, you know, stop, because I'd love to know how this plan is going to play out before the mayor changes, you know.
Yeah.
You know, given that it was done under a, you know, a specific type of leadership, one wonders, you know, what will happen next. I mean, there are political people in the political wings right now who would like to do away and start fresh with the whole BPDA. But I suppose you always have that. But, you know, and this is already a fresh BPDA set of personalities from the previous mayor. So there's always a kind of flushing that I think happens, and then everybody, you start reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one difference, and we're sort of wrapping up here, but one difference I see is that it's quite rigorous in terms of its data and visualization of data and the consequences for from the citywide shadow laws to the individual block, and that's something we don't see in London. How do you measure the benefits and not of that of kind of what you've been able to achieve in Boston generally, and which do you prefer?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one. I don't know. I mean, I really can't answer what I prefer. I mean, I have to say I found the Boston system, the Boston process a little bit frustrating. And I think it's probably more on the level of the personalities some of the personalities that were part of the original group we were working with, the BPDA, who, and this is going to sound really bad because well, actually, maybe I won't even say it. I think I'm very heartened right now by, what's happening where, we have this system in place now where there is design support being kind of airlifted, if you like, into local councils. And I think that to be able to visualize and provide that kind of information that's very digestible for everyone is incredibly important. But I also think that you have to that there's I found a lack of clarity of what the brief was. I felt like the brief for this was written without the city understanding what the deliverable would really be that they would get. So I found it slightly irresponsible that in fact, they had never mapped three-dimensionally what the impact of the shadow laws were. So there are things like that, which I'd like to think wouldn't happen in London, but who knows? We all know things, the capacity varies, and I know that's a big issue with the white paper. The capacity varies borough, local council to local council. So, if you're dealing with a place that, has resource and wants to understand the regulations it's put in place before it gets consultants on board to either challenge or work with those, then that's great. But if you don't, you spend a lot of time, that 18 months that we proposed, there was probably a good 3 months, at the onset that could have been saved if they had a better understanding of what they had, in many cases, inherited, So more, I guess I would urge local authorities, before you bring in consultants to look at something specific, to really have a deep understanding of the impact of what you have today, or at least understand, what it could mean. And, obviously consultants need to help you look at that. But I guess it just felt like we revealed a lot of surprises for them, I think, which is great,
That's useful.
Yeah, it's useful. And let's hope that they do the right thing with the information. But
well, good clients make good projects.
Yes, well, I think
the adage.
Yeah, very much the case. And I think my big worry, in the way this is hanging in the balance right now, because I could see this going in that direction, is that because they will be worried that they will get challenged in making this, what's quite a radical change to the system, and sort of saying, let's wipe the slate clean. And they were never willing to sort of say, yeah, we're just going to get rid of all the PDAs and start fresh. That unless you're willing to do that, then have you just wasted the public's money in bringing us in and saying we need a clearer system? And that would be sad if that was the case. You always have to draw a line in the sand and say, now things are different. You can't always bring forward the past as past regimes as you go forward. Yeah.
Well, I mean, this has been really, I don't think we look outside of London enough, and as well as many, how insular the scene can get. So I think that the more we kind of reflect through kind of exercises like this is really useful. So thank you for that. And I know you can't hear the applause, but
no, my pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you for spending the last night before lockdown listening to rather than being at the pub. You might be wishing you chose the pub, but anyway.
Well, there's still some few hours left, so you can
That's
kind
right.
of, let your hair down.
Yes, there are a few things, yeah, you drown your sorrows. Okay, thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you everyone out there for joining. And yeah, please join us next week and log on to the events website for more events we're holding soon. Thank you everyone and good night.
Good night.